The massive harvester vessel called Ascending will emerged from Fold space near the third planet of the Sol system. It had been traveling for 6 months through the dark corridors between stars, carrying a crew of 3,000 soldiers and scientists. Their mission was simple. They had come to collect what belonged to them. High Commander stood on the observation deck and watched as the distant blue planet grew larger in the viewing screens. He was old by standards, having lived for nearly 800 years, and he had participated in dozens of harvesting operations across the galaxy. This one should have been routine. According to their ancient records, the third planet held a population of primitive mammals that they had seeded there 500,000 years ago. These creatures would be collected, processed, and distributed across the Dominion as labor stock. It was the same process they had repeated thousands of times on thousands of worlds. Science Overseer approached him with a data tablet in her four-fingered hands. Her face showed an expression that had learned to recognize over their many years of service together. Something was wrong. "Commander, I need you to look at these readings," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was tension beneath it. Took the tablet and examined the sensor data. At first he thought the equipment had malfunctioned. The readings showed massive energy signatures spread across the entire star system. There were artificial structures orbiting the third planet, structures larger than anything they had ever built. The fourth planet, which their records showed as a barren red desert, was now covered with lights that indicated billions of inhabitants. Even the moons of the large gas giant in the outer system showed signs of heavy industrial activity. "Run the diagnostics again," ordered. "These readings cannot be accurate." Shook her head slowly. "We have run them 7 times already. The readings are accurate. The primitive species we seeded here has somehow developed a civilization that spans their entire star system." Felt something he had not experienced in centuries. Fear. The Dominion had controlled the galaxy for 8 million years. They had seeded countless worlds with primitive life forms, waited for those life forms to evolve into useful species, and then harvested them for labor. It was a system that had worked perfectly since before recorded history. No seeded species had ever developed technology advanced enough to threaten the Dominion. Most of them never progressed beyond simple farming before the harvesters arrived. But these readings suggested something impossible. The creatures on the third planet had not only developed technology, they had developed technology that appeared to surpass themselves. "How long has it been since our monitoring probes went silent?" asked. "Approximately 12,000 local years," replied. "We assumed the probes had simply degraded over time. It was not considered significant." 12,000 years. In cosmic terms, it was nothing. They measured their history in millions of years. 12,000 years should not have been enough time for any species to advance from primitive tool use to this level of development. And yet the evidence was right in front of them. The communication system activated with a sharp tone that made everyone on the observation deck turn toward the main screen. An incoming transmission was being received, signaled for it to be displayed. A creature appeared on the screen. It stood upright on 2 legs and had smooth skin without scales or fur. Its eyes were forward-facing like a predator, and its mouth moved as it spoke in a language that the translation systems quickly decoded. What shocked most was that the creature was speaking in perfect. "Attention, unidentified vessel. You have entered Terran collective space. State your designation and purpose. You have 1 standard cycle to comply. Failure to respond will result in defensive action." The transmission ended. Stood in silence as his crew looked to him for guidance. In all his centuries of service, he had never received a communication like this from a seeded world. The species they harvested did not have communication technology. They did not have defensive capabilities. They certainly did not speak. "Commander," one of his officers said nervously, "what are your orders?" Before could respond, the sensors detected movement. Hundreds of objects were approaching from the inner system at speeds that should not have been possible. As they grew closer, the sensors identified them as vessels of some kind, but their design was unlike anything in the database. They were sleek and angular, covered in geometric patterns that seemed to shift and change as they moved. The lead vessel was enormous. It dwarfed the ascending the way a mountain dwarfs a stone. Its surface was covered with weapon systems that the sensors could barely comprehend. Energy readings from its engines alone exceeded the total output of the ascending by a factor of 1,000. Was the first to speak. "Commander, I am reading over 300 vessels. The smallest of them outguns us significantly. The largest one could destroy our entire fleet without difficulty." Understood what this meant. The harvesting mission was over before it had begun. The creatures they had come to collect as livestock had become something else entirely. They had become a power that even the mighty Dominion could not challenge. "Open a communication channel," ordered. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly as he clasped them behind his back. "Inform them that we are the harvester vessel ascending from the Dominion. Tell them we come in peace and wish to establish diplomatic relations." It was a lie, of course. They had not come in peace. They had come to enslave an entire species, but was old enough and wise enough to know when a situation had changed beyond recovery. Whatever these creatures were, whatever they had become in the 500,000 years since they had seeded their world, they were no longer prey. They were something far more dangerous. As the massive human vessels surrounded the ascending wondered how the Dominion would react to his report. For 8 million years, they had been the supreme power in the galaxy. They had never encountered a species they could not control. That had just changed. The creatures called themselves humans, and they were waiting for answers. Admiral Laura Mitchell stood in her office aboard Citadel Prime and read the intelligence report for the third time. The words had not changed, but she still found them difficult to believe. After centuries of wondering whether humanity was alone in the universe, they finally had their answer. They were not alone, and the species that had found them was the same species that had created them. Commander Daniel Vance stood on the other side of her desk, waiting patiently for her to finish reading. He was a tall man with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He had served as her head of intelligence for 15 years, and she trusted his judgment completely. "The genetic analysis is confirmed," Laura said finally. "These actually seeded Earth with our ancestors 500,000 years ago." Daniel nodded. "We decrypted their records within hours of capturing their vessel. They have been doing this for 8 million years. They seed worlds with primitive life forms, wait for those life forms to evolve into useful species, and then return to harvest them as slave labor. According to their projections, they expected to find us living in mud huts and farming with wooden tools." Laura set down the report and walked to the window. Outside, the vast expanse of space stretched in every direction. She could see dozens of ships moving between stations, carrying goods and people across the solar system that humanity now called home. 400 billion humans lived in this system alone, spread across planets and moons and orbital habitats that their ancestors could never have imagined. "What do they want?" she asked. "Originally, they came to enslave us. Now they want to negotiate. Their commander seems to have realized very quickly that their original mission is no longer possible." Laura turned back to face him. "Bring them to the diplomatic station near Neptune. I want a full display of our capabilities during transport. Let them see exactly what they are dealing with." The delegation arrived at the station 2 days later. During their journey, they had witnessed things that shattered every assumption they held about the universe. They saw defense platforms capable of cracking moons. They saw ships that moved faster than light without using the fold space technology that they had spent millions of years developing. They saw energy signatures that their scientists could not even identify, let alone understand. By the time High Commander entered the diplomatic chamber, His earlier arrogance had been replaced by something closer to terror. He stood with his delegation in a posture that human researchers had already identified as submissive. They were not used to feeling small, but standing before the representatives of humanity, they felt very small indeed. Laura entered the chamber with two guards at her side. She wore her formal uniform, decorated with the medals and ribbons of a 40-year career in the Terran Defense Corps. Her gray hair was pulled back tightly, and her face showed no emotion as she took her seat across from the High Commander, she said. I understand you have questions. Struggled to find the right words. He had prepared speeches and arguments, strategies for negotiating favorable terms with primitive species. None of that was useful now. These creatures were not primitive. They were something else entirely. Admiral Mitchell, he said finally, in our entire recorded history spanning 8 million years, we have never encountered a species that advanced as quickly as yours. Most species take 2 to 3 million years to reach our level of technology. Many never reach it at all, but your species has surpassed us in less than 500,000 years. He paused, and his four eyes looked at her with a mixture of fear and fascination. How is this possible? Laura did not smile. She activated a holographic display in the center of the chamber. Images began to appear, showing Earth across the vast span of human history. Ice ages that covered entire continents, volcanic eruptions that blocked the sun for years, asteroid impacts that wiped out most life on the planet, plagues that killed millions, wars that devastated civilizations. You seeded our ancestors on one of the most hostile environments in the galaxy, Laura said. Every generation faced extinction. Every century brought new disasters. The world you gave us tried to kill us every single day. And because of that, we learned to adapt faster than any species you have ever encountered. Watched the images with growing horror. They selected their seeding worlds carefully, choosing planets with stable environments where species could develop slowly and peacefully. They had not realized that Earth was different. We did not know, he said quietly. Our surveys indicated a suitable environment. Your surveys were wrong, but that is not the only reason we developed so quickly. Laura changed the display to show human expansion across the solar system and then beyond. When we finally reached the stars, we discovered something that changed everything. We discovered what you do to the species you seed. The chamber fell silent, understood immediately what she meant. Humanity had found the other worlds, the harvested populations, the billions of sentient beings that had been processed as slave labor across the. They knew. We found the records of your operations, Laura continued. We found the worlds where you bred entire species for nothing but servitude. We found the facilities where you processed them, separated families, worked them to death, and replaced them with new generations bred to be even more obedient. Her voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it. We found everything. Tried to speak, but no words came. The system that his species had built over millions of years, the foundation of their entire civilization, had just been exposed to a species powerful enough to challenge it. Laura stood and looked down at him. The Terran Collective does not negotiate with slavers. You have 48 hours to transmit the coordinates of every seeded world in your dominion. You will release all harvested populations immediately. Failure to comply will be interpreted as an act of war. She walked toward the exit while his delegation sat in stunned silence. At the door she paused and turned back. Your dominion spent 8 million years building an empire on the backs of enslaved species. You assumed you would never face consequences because no species could challenge you. Her eyes met his across the chamber. Consider carefully whether you wish to test what humanity can accomplish in 48 hours. She left the chamber. Behind her, finally understood the situation completely. They had created humanity as livestock. Instead, they had created the instrument of their own destruction. 12 hours later, the Dominion surrendered unconditionally. Commander Christopher had seen many things during his 20 years of service in the Terran Exploration Corps. He had walked on worlds where the sky burned with 3 suns. He had discovered life forms that existed as pure energy. He had mapped star systems so ancient that their planets had turned to dust, but nothing had prepared him for what he found in the archives of Prime. His ship, the Resolute Dawn, had arrived at the 3 weeks after the surrender. The crew of 200 specialists had been trained for first contact situations and humanitarian operations. Their mission was to document the full scope of activities and begin the process of locating all harvested populations across the galaxy. Dr. Torres served as the ship's chief scientist. She was a small woman with dark hair and intense eyes that seemed to absorb every detail around her. For years, she had studied the genetic signatures that proved humanity's origins were not entirely natural. Now she stood in the central archives of the species that had created her ancestors and tried to comprehend the scale of what they had done. "The records go back 8 million years," she said to Christopher as they walked through corridors lined with data storage units. "They seeded their first world when humans were nothing but small creatures hiding from predators in the grass. Since then, they have repeated the process on approximately 47,000 planets." Christopher tried to process that number. 47,000 worlds. 47,000 species created and harvested like crops. "How many individuals are we talking about?" he asked. Consulted her data pad. Her hands shook slightly as she read the numbers. Based on their records, the current population of harvested beings across the Dominion is approximately 300 billion. That does not include the countless billions who lived and died in slavery over the past 8 million years. They entered a room filled with holographic displays, activated the main system, and images began to appear. Christopher saw species of every kind. Some looked similar to humans. Others were completely alien, with multiple limbs or no limbs at all, with scales or feathers or skin that changed colors. All of them had one thing in common. They had been bred for obedience and used as disposable labor. "They kept them deliberately primitive," explained. "Any seeded world that showed signs of rapid technological advancement was sterilized and reseeded. They learned early that intelligent species were harder to control, so they engineered their populations to remain at pre-industrial levels forever." Christopher felt sick. Then why did they leave Earth alone? Pulled up a specific file and displayed it on the screen. It showed Earth as it appeared nearly 500,000 years ago. The file contained observation notes written by scientists who had monitored the planet in its early days. "They were afraid of us," said. "Their observations concluded that humans were excessively aggressive compared to other seeded species. We fought constantly. We killed each other over territory and resources and things they could not even understand. They decided to wait longer before harvesting, assuming our violent nature would lead to self-destruction." She changed the display to show a timeline. "By the time they realized we had not destroyed ourselves, their monitoring probes had failed. They lost track of us for 12,000 years. When they finally returned, they found something they never expected." Christopher understood now. The same violent nature that had frightened them had driven humanity to survive and advance. While other seeded species accepted their place in the universe, humans had refused to accept anything. They had fought against their environment, against each other, and ultimately against the very concept of limitation. That refusal had made them strong in ways they could never have predicted. "There is something else," said quietly. She led him to another section of the archives where records of failed seeding operations were stored. Not every species accepted their fate. Some tried to resist when the harvesters came. They have detailed records of every resistance movement across their history. The images that appeared were disturbing. Species that had tried to fight back were dealt with brutally. Entire populations were executed as examples. Worlds were burned clean and reseeded with more docile life forms. The message was clear. Resistance was not tolerated. They destroyed anyone who threatened their system, said. For 8 million years, no species successfully resisted them, until now. Christopher looked at the records of destroyed civilizations and felt a weight settle on his shoulders. Humanity had not just escaped enslavement. They had become the first species in 8 million years capable of ending the system entirely. That responsibility was enormous. How do we even begin to fix this? He asked. Did not have a good answer. The scale of the problem was almost beyond comprehension. 300 billion beings scattered across 47,000 worlds. Most of them had been slaves for so many generations that they did not know any other way of life. Their cultures had been erased. Their histories had been rewritten. Their very genetics had been modified to make them obedient. We start by finding them, said finally. We document everything. We create a complete record of what was done so that it can never be or forgotten. And then we begin the work of helping them remember who they were. Christopher nodded slowly. It would take centuries, maybe longer, but humanity had time. More importantly, humanity had the power to make it happen. The Dominion had fallen in 48 hours. Rebuilding what they had destroyed would take much longer, but it was possible. The galaxy needs to see this, he said. All of it. Every species needs to know what was done and who did it. Agreed. She began the process of copying the archive data for transmission back to Earth. The truth would spread across the stars like light spreading through darkness, and nothing would ever be the same again. For 8 million years, they had hidden their crimes behind the vastness of space. Now humanity had found them, and humanity would not let the galaxy forget. The Terran Assembly Chamber was the largest enclosed space ever built by humanity. It could hold 10,000 representatives from every corner of human civilization, and on this day, every seat was filled. Admiral Laura Mitchell stood at the central podium and delivered the report that would change the course of galactic history. We have confirmed the existence of 47,000 worlds currently holding harvested populations, she announced. Her voice carried across the vast chamber through speakers hidden in walls that curved upward like the inside of a great shell. Conservative estimates suggest 300 billion sentient beings are living under control. Most have no knowledge of their true origins. They do not know that other species exist. They do not know that freedom is possible. The chamber erupted in voices. Some demanded immediate military action. Others called for careful planning. Representative Cole from Mars argued that humanity had a moral obligation to intervene. Senator Amy Richardson from Earth warned that rushing in without preparation could cause more harm than good. The debate continued for hours as representatives struggled with the weight of what they had learned. In the end, the vote was unanimous. Humanity would not stand by while billions suffered. Operation New Dawn was approved with full funding and unlimited resources. It would be the largest coordinated effort in human history. Captain Bradley received his assignment 6 months later. He would command the Liberation Fleet sent to the system, where 60 million members of a species called the had been held as slaves for over 200,000 years. His orders were clear. Neutralize all military assets. Secure the population. Begin the process of education and integration. Had served in the fleet for 18 years. He had participated in rescue operations and humanitarian missions across a dozen systems, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he would find on. The military operation itself was simple. Defense platforms fell within minutes under the combined firepower of the Liberation Fleet. Ground forces surrendered without significant resistance. The Dominion had accepted defeat, and their soldiers had no desire to die for an empire that no longer existed. Within one standard day, that was secure. The real challenge came afterward. Dr. Grant served as the fleet's chief cultural liaison. She accompanied to the surface for initial contact with the population. They landed near what appeared to be the largest settlement, a sprawling complex of simple buildings arranged in geometric patterns around central work areas. They came out to meet them. They were tall and thin, with gray skin and large eyes that blinked slowly in the unfamiliar sunlight. Their movements were careful and deliberate, as if they were constantly waiting for someone to tell them what to do next. Tried to explain what was happening. He told them that they were gone and would never return. He told them they were free to make their own choices now. He told them that humanity had come to help them build a new future. They did not understand. They looked at him with expressions that mixed fear and confusion. Some of them began to tremble. Others dropped to the ground in what appeared to be postures of submission. "They do not know what freedom means," said quietly. "They have been slaves for over 200,000 years. That is more than 8,000 generations. Every aspect of their culture, their language, their identity has been built around service to the..." Watched as a young approached one of his soldiers and knelt before her. The soldier looked uncomfortable and tried to help the stand. But they resisted, clearly believing that standing in the presence of their new masters was not permitted. "Liberation is not enough," continued. "We cannot just remove thee and expect everything to change. We need to help them remember who they were before all of this, and for most of them there is no memory to recover. They have been what they are for longer than our species has existed." The medical teams began their work immediately. They set up clinics and started treating diseases that they had never bothered to cure. Engineers began rebuilding infrastructure that had been kept primitive by design. Educators started the long process of teaching skills and histories that had been deliberately suppressed. Spent weeks on the surface, watching his people work alongside the. Progress was slow. Many of them remained afraid of their liberators, unable to accept that the humans truly meant them no harm. Some refused to eat unless given permission. Others would not sleep until ordered to do so. The psychological damage of 200,000 years of slavery could not be undone in weeks or months. But there were also moments of hope. Watched as a group of young learned to read for the first time. He saw their eyes widen as they realized that the marks on paper could represent ideas and thoughts. He observed as an older discovered that she could say no to a request without being punished. The look on her face when she understood that simple truth was something he would never forget. "How many worlds need this level of help?" asked one evening as they watched the sun set over the settlement. She checked her data pad. 47,000, give or take. At our current rate, full liberation and rehabilitation will take approximately 300 years. Considered that number. 300 years of work across thousands of worlds. Billions of beings who needed to be taught what it meant to be free. It was a task so large that it seemed almost impossible. But humanity had done impossible things before. They had survived a death world. They had reached the stars. They had defeated an empire that had ruled the galaxy for 8 million years. Compared to those achievements, teaching freedom to the enslaved was simply the next step. "Then we had better get started," said. He turned back toward the settlement where lights were beginning to appear in windows. Somewhere in there, they were learning to live without masters for the first time in their history. It would be difficult. It would take generations. But it was necessary work, and humanity would see it through. 5 years had passed since the fall of the Dominion. The empire that had ruled the galaxy for 8 million years existed now only in history files and memories. Its fleets had been dismantled. Its leaders had been tried for crimes against countless species. Its systems of control and oppression had been torn apart piece by piece. High Commander had spent those 5 years in a comfortable detention facility on one of Jupiter's moons. He was not treated cruelly. The humans provided him with food and shelter and access to information about the changing galaxy. They even allowed him visitors from what remained of society. But he was not free, and he understood why. He had commanded a harvesting vessel. He had participated in the enslavement of species. The humans could not simply forgive that. On a warm afternoon by Earth standards, Admiral Laura Mitchell came to see him. She was older now, her gray hair thinner and her movements slower than they had been 5 years ago. But her eyes were still sharp, and her voice still carried the authority of someone who had changed the course of history. "I have arranged for you to visit Earth," she said. "There is something I want you to see." They traveled together in a small vessel that descended through clouds and blue sky until it reached a garden near what the humans called the Pacific Ocean. The garden was beautiful, filled with plants and flowers that did not recognize. The air smelled of salt and growing things. It was very different from the controlled environments of Prime. Laura led him to a bench overlooking the water and sat down beside him. For a long moment neither of them spoke. They simply watched the waves roll in from the distant horizon. "I have spent these years trying to understand," said finally. "We controlled 1,000 star systems. We had subjugated hundreds of species across millions of years. We believed ourselves the greatest civilization in the galaxy." He paused and looked at her with eyes that held no hostility, only confusion. "How did we fail so completely?" Laura considered the question carefully before answering. "You did not fail in the way you think. You simply encountered something you could not have predicted." "But we predicted everything," insisted. "Our models accounted for every possible variable: technological development rates, social evolution patterns, environmental factors. We had 8 million years of data. We knew how species developed." Laura smiled slightly. It was not a cruel smile. "Your models assumed that all species would follow similar paths. You assumed that development was gradual and predictable. You never considered what might happen when a species had no choice but to advance or die." She gestured at the garden around them. "You gave us a world that tried to kill us. Every generation faced extinction, ice ages, volcanic winters, plagues, asteroid impacts. We could not afford to develop slowly like other species. We had to adapt immediately or disappear forever." Listened in silence. He had studied the environmental history of Earth since his capture. He knew that Laura spoke the truth. The planet that they had chosen for their seeding experiment was far more hostile than anything in their standard protocols. "But that alone does not explain everything," he said. "Other species on hostile worlds simply went extinct. You survived and thrived." Laura nodded. "Because we are stubborn, because we refuse to accept limitations, because when the universe tells us something is impossible, we treat that as a challenge rather than a boundary." She turned to face him directly. "Your other seeded species accepted their place in the natural order. We never did. We looked at death and decided we would not accept it. We looked at the stars and decided they belonged to us. We looked at your empire and decided it had no right to exist." Absorbed her words. They had always valued order and stability. Their civilization was built on careful planning and predictable outcomes. They had spent millions of years perfecting a system that worked. The idea of refusing to accept reality was foreign to everything they believed. "And now," he asked, "what happens now that you have destroyed everything we built?" Laura looked out at the ocean. "Now we rebuild, not the way you built, through control and domination, but through cooperation and choice. 300 billion beings are learning what it means to be free. It will take centuries, maybe longer, but we will see it through." She reached into her pocket and removed a small object. It was a communicator, similar to the ones officers carried. "Your people have a choice now," she said. "You can spend the next million years mourning what you lost. You can isolate yourselves and fade into irrelevance, or you can help us build something better." She offered him the communicator. "They are learning to read for the first time in 200,000 years. They have scholars and teachers who could help them. If your people are willing to serve others instead of enslaving them, there is a place for you in the new galaxy." Took the communicator and held it carefully. For 800 years he had served the Dominion without question. He had believed that they were special, that their way was the only way. Now that belief lay shattered beyond repair. But perhaps something new could grow from the wreckage. "If I agree to this," he said slowly, My people will never rule again. We will be servants to the species we once enslaved." Laura shook her head. "You will not be servants. You will be partners. There is a difference, and it is time your species learned what that difference means." Sat in silence for a long time, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. The sky turned orange and gold, colors he had never seen on his own. Somewhere out there, across the vast darkness of space, billions of beings were waking up to new lives. They needed help. They needed teachers and guides and friends. They had spent 8 million years taking from the galaxy. Perhaps it was time they learned to give instead. Activated the communicator, and spoke the words that would change his species forever. "This is High Commander. I am contacting the Terran Collective to offer the services of the people. We are ready to help." On the bench beside him, Admiral Laura Mitchell smiled. The sun set over the Pacific Ocean, and somewhere in the distance, a new day was beginning for the galaxy. They had created humanity as livestock. Instead, they had created their teachers. And the lesson was just beginning.